In my last video, I explained where the resiliency and strength of an agricultural ecosystem came from. We talked about how elements in this food production system are all integrated, whereas in our conventional agricultural system, everything is separated, which requires much higher energy inputs and results in a disconnected, broken system. Today, I want to talk about another reason why agricultural ecosystems or food forests are the food production system that we should be implementing for the future. I want to discuss annual conventional agriculture versus perennial agricultural ecosystems. Annual means once per year. Our staple food crops, such as corn, wheat, and beans, are all annual crops, which means you plant the seed, they grow and produce a grain, and then die, all within 1 year. Perennial means more than one. Plants like fruit trees, berry bushes, grapevines, nut trees, garlic, onion, asparagus, artichokes, kale, and rhubarb are all perennial, which means you plant them once and they just keep on giving. So let's chat about some of those differences. The first thing I want to talk about is non-renewable resources. Annual agriculture relies on non-renewable resources, or oil, to continue. Currently, fossil fuels are pretty cheap. However, we're quickly approaching a state which is called peak oil. I'll make a more detailed video of peak oil in the future, but to quickly summarize, currently there are 7 billion people in the world, and we collectively use 87 million barrels of oil every day. Because our population is growing and we're consuming a lot, analysts predict that by 2025, our use of oil will be up to 127 barrels of oil every day. Do we have enough oil? Let's take a look at our graph that explains the current state and what's going to happen once we reach peak oil. So we have the world oil supply on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. Let's say our graph starts at the year 1900, when our use of oil was negligent. By the 1950s, however, we were starting to find more oil reserves, and in the last 50 years, that has skyrocketed. We're at this point right now, and what is happening to our oil supply is it has or will soon reach its peak, which means that we aren't finding any new reserves, and we have now used up 50% of our supply, which will steadily decline. But we still have this 50%, right? Yes, and the remaining 50% of oil reserves are the ones where oil is costly and difficult to access. What is more is that while our oil supply has started to decline, people all around the world still consume just as much oil as they ever did. Our entire economy relies and is based on oil. We need oil to run our cars, to make clothes, to build iPods. But worse yet, we need oil to annually grow our staple food crops, to transport this food to the stores, to package this food so that we can buy it with our money that has also been made using oil. What's going to fill in this gap? Nothing. As former petroleum industry analyst Jan Lundberg said, the nation and most of the rest of the world is chasing a techno fix instead of adjusting to ecological and economic reality. So getting back to annual agriculture, it unfortunately relies on oil. We need to go across the field with a tractor to spray chemicals, then again to plant seeds, again to spray fertilizer, again to harvest the crop, and again to get rid of the debris either by burning or baling. All of these processes are separate trips across the field, with only the harvest trip leading to some sort of economic return. And you have to do it all with energy input every single year. Perennial agriculture, as seen in an ecological food forest, doesn't rely on non-renewable resources to continue perpetually. Once you plant a perennial seed, it will continue to grow and give you a return for many years to come. You plant an apple tree, hazelnut tree, grapevine, raspberry bush once, and it will produce fruit every year until it dies. One of the oldest trees of all time happens to be a chestnut tree growing on Mount Etna in Sicily. This tree has been producing crops of chestnuts every year for the past 4,000 years. You can also design your agricultural ecosystem so that every time you go through it, you're simultaneously managing one or two crops, such as pruning or weeding, while harvesting another. An example of this is letting pigs roam through your woody crops and eat rotting fruit at the bottom of trees. This decreases the spread of disease while giving your pigs a nice treat. Another example is pruning a fruit tree and inoculating the pruned branches with fungus to grow some mushrooms. Imagine your crop lasting 4,000 years. The second thing I want to talk about is sunlight. Each year, an annual plant has to put a ton of their energy that it's getting from the sun and getting from us into growing an entire new plant. This allocates less energy into creating the grain or fruit or vegetable that we would like to eat. We plant our corn and wheat in the spring, and by the beginning of July, these plants are only up to our knees. By this point, we're already almost 2 weeks past the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year. After that point, our sunlight hours are declining, and our plants are only up to our knees. Because we have a variety of crops in our agricultural ecosystem, we'll reap the benefits of their harvest from May to late October. Cropping systems based on woody plants like shrubs and trees are also able to capture 3 to 7 times the energy per acre as annual crop fields. With wheat and corn, you have plants that are all the same height. The sun is only hitting one layer of plant. A lot of energy is being wasted. With a multi-layer cropping ecosystem, the sun is able to hit different layers and dimensions, exposing different areas in your crop to different amounts of sun, creating niches for different levels of light tolerance. A sun-loving plant will thrive where there's full exposure, but you'll still be able to grow a ton of different plants in the shade of your larger crops. The third thing I want to talk about is water. Everything needs water to grow. Annual crops typically need to be irrigated, which means a system is set up on the field to pump water in and distribute it around the crop. Well, what about rain? Can't it just get the water from rain? Well, annual crops do get rain, but most of the rainwater runs off the field and doesn't actually soak into the soil to help the plants grow. If you look at a wheat field and the farmer's herbicides are working well, the spaces between the wheat plants will be bare earth. Nothing will be able to grow there because of the blast of chemicals it gets. When rain comes down and hits this bare earth, it will erode and run off the ground. It will pelt the earth so hard that it'll take small particles of soil with it as it rolls off the compacted dirt and into the ditches nearby. Very little of the rain actually infiltrates into the soil to help the plants. Erosion from rain and wind due to this bare earth between the plants causes our fertile topsoil to slowly wash away, carrying any nutrients and minerals with it to the nearby waterways. This creates further problems in our local streams and lakes, which become saturated with our crops' fertilizers and chemicals, resulting in sad, dead aquatic life. When an agricultural ecosystem receives a hard and heavy downpour, the first crop to get pounded by the rain are the large trees. Their canopy of leaves catches the raindrops, which eventually make it through the maze of foliage to pour down on the bushes and plants below. Once the water finally hits the ground, which is covered by perennial grasses and shrubs, it's quite gentle. Trees and shrubs are like sponges on the face of the earth. You give them rain and they'll eagerly soak up as much as they can before the soil is saturated and the water moves on. To keep the rainwater on our land, we can create shallow, even trenches on the ground called swales, which will store and slow the water, allowing more to infiltrate into our crop. By designing water features like swales and ponds, along with our multi-level cropping system, into our ecosystem, we can ensure that every drop of water that falls onto our crop stays there. Because the rain is softened by our trees and shrubs, and when it does hit the ground, it meets vegetation instead of bare earth, erosion and depletion of our valuable topsoil does not occur. Instead, in our agricultural ecosystem, through leaf debris, decomposition, and livestock fertilizer, we're actually actively creating soil. In summary, perennial crops are pretty damn awesome. Now, I'm definitely not saying that we shouldn't grow annual plants ever again. I love annual plants. I love corn and tomatoes and beans and rice and pretty much anything that you can make from wheat. What I'm suggesting is that to be dependent on these annual crops as our sole staple food crops that are essentially used to provide our oils, proteins, and carbohydrates to the world is at best short sighted. We need to design more perennial agricultural ecosystems that can provide our oils, proteins, and carbohydrates sustainably and permanently. We need to support local farmers who are trying to transition their food production system to one with woody, perennial, and polycultural components. This starts with knowing where our food comes from, how it's produced, and how it ultimately ends up on our plates. Thanks for watching, guys. Next time, I'm going to talk about how food production and the role of the farmer has changed through time. Stay tuned.